So I'm going to just start the fourth panel. I know that the last one, so you are courageous enough to hear and attend this quite critical actually on the big players as actors of contemporary warfare. It's a key topic. Luckily enough, and hopefully the conference under the patronage of the CARISM Center and not the Strategic Center, meaning that we are not able to focus only on war studies, but a wide range of disciplines, from CIS to international relations, to technology, communication studies as well. So this is quite, I would say, quite a very interesting and relevant set of disciplines here. We got five speakers dealing with very different topics, but we're trying to express this very systemic nature and practical nature of this web platform, mainly trying to evolve more and more into our issue. So definitely we will grasp in a few minutes the topic we are going to deal with. Needless to say, this topic is greatly informed by the ongoing war in Ukraine, I would say, during the past interventions. And here, perhaps the main novelty of the conflict lies in the deadly, in some way, intervention of the different architects of our digital world. So maybe just first, mainly from first various means, from Microsoft to Google, from Twitter to Facebook, Valentine, and so on. So these some of these companies were already present for quite a long time into the Ukrainian territory and networks, where they contributed what they had to avoid a destructive scenario, which many experts and observers talk about for many years, but which are announced but did not materialize. So the actors, and we are going to debate this. Some of the actors are active quite opportunistic of what they're feeling, like Musk making available these false-calling terminals. When the biceps system, the 100 others have taken a side to the conflict, especially with the major, I would say, regarding here reaction to the moderation. Where to decide to the purpose. So we have very serious questions actually about the plans, about the stages, about the responsibility into these contemporary conflicts. Sometimes they do contribute to the revolutions, but in parallel, we have just here for private companies which stay to display their own involvements into our issues. So this is the channel level for all of us, beginning to analyze this complex reshaping of all our, I would say, warfare and conflict issues. So without further ado, and we just said the mic to Jasper. So Jasper on the case for possible researcher at the University of Antwerp, and you're going to talk about the infrastructural impacts of some of the big tech companies in the context of warfare, and you'll be into intertwine with the media studies and the STS perspective on this particular issue. So the floor is yours, and thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, we're really at the beginning of the research project Platform Wars, together with Marijn Hoijtink, who's presenting after me. But what I would like to discuss with you in my presentation is our first research goal, which is to create a mapping of the platform technologies to demonstrate the potential impact on warfare. Now, this type of mapping What is crucial are the methodological and conceptual frameworks, a mindset, if you will, as we've seen in the last 2 days as well, with which to collect, categorize, and analyze these technologies. Now, as you can imagine, this is quite a hard thing to do, to create a mapping of platform technologies, especially in the realm of warfare. And also because platforms are quite a polysemic notion. However, with the growing grip of platforms and big tech companies on military activities, but also with the concurrent rise of geopolitical concerns, this discussion reaches a new salience. So in short, what I want to do today is briefly take you through my thinking process, or the ongoing process to conceptualize platforms and their impact. So I'm building mostly, as it was announced, on the STS and actor network theory, I should say, to argue that we should analyze platforms not as an object, but rather to analyze platforms as a dynamic and relational process, which ideally needs to be studied in action. And more specifically, I draw on the work from political economist Corey Kaleskan to argue that platforms should also be seen as stack processes, which layer different forms of militarization and economization in complex ways. So following the Russian invasion in Ukraine, Clearview AI, a New York-based startup company, reached out to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense to offer access to its platform. Clearview AI is a facial recognition company that scrapes images from social media websites and stores them in a searchable database. Its algorithms are trained to match against images in that database, which allow its clients, to mostly law enforcement, to identify subjects of interest by uploading their photos. Clearview AI, its platform, is used by Ukrainian armed forces in the war in the Ukraine to identify that's Russian soldiers and prisoners of war, but also to screen people on the move passing through security checkpoints. So examples like this demonstrate that platform corporations have become critical in the provision of the underlying data and digital infrastructures within warfare. A quick look at the operations of these platforms companies such as Google and Amazon, here in the bottom example, and which is also mentioned today by Marcelo, of Project Nimbus, clearly shows how they move beyond market relations as they increasingly supply the military with the latest technology. This presents a fundamental challenge for our understanding of contemporary warfare, which is the growing involvement of big tech within the military domain, but also the broader platformization of the military. But the multiplication and intersectionality of these platforms empirically supports the call for a reconciliation between platform studies and infrastructure studies. One of the starting points of this project is that platforms are increasingly operating as infrastructures and have acquired properties that are generally considered to be typical of infrastructures, such as scale, ubiquity, and temporality. However, I would like to expand on the dynamic perspective in the mapping or our study of platforms. And it is insufficient to see platforms as mere interactions between platform companies and the military. The multi-purpose and dynamic universe of platforms exceed public-private relations. Platforms mobilize a series of opportunities that can be best understood, perhaps as stacks. Now, I'm sure all of you know, or many of you know, are familiar with the notion of stacks as it is presented by Benjamin Bratton. This is not what I have in mind, however, but to summarize, Bratton provides a geography of platformization. It is a spatial approach or a techno-nationalist approach, as I learned yesterday. He suggests that a new social geography is emerging with new possibilities for economic and political engagement. Bratton tends to objectify stacked economic and political relations, however, and I therefore follow Kaleskan's work, who says that we can still conceive platforms as stacking, but more as layering together interdependent configurations. For instance, his work is on cryptocurrency exchange platforms, which is of course very different. And he argues that platforms works can be described as stack economization, which also built on the work of Michel Caron. referring to the mutually supporting and enabling platform-based exchange, production, barter, and representation practices that their makers and observers qualify as economic. So this picture is actually from his book as well. So that portrays a stacked economization process. Adopting this approach, I'm trying to do two things. The platforms that we are interested in are delivering an empirically observable range of economic functions, as you can see, for example, with the cryptocurrency exchange, but it's of course very different in our empirical data. Moreover, and this is my addition to the theory, they are delivering an empirically observable range of military functions. And these are just placeholders. These are the official military functions, but the empirical data should illustrate or inductively help us conceptualize these stacked functions. So the stack is a research tool for me to study platforms, not to explain or fix what a platform is or is not, or go straight to grand concepts like platform capitalism. The multiplicity of these platform practices mark empirically observable processes that, following Kalescan, we might call stack militarization. We can also draw on the work of Paul Durisch and Donald Mackenzie. These data infrastructures have varying degrees of limits and openings. In other words, we should focus on the range of practices that are made possible by the platform, but these technologies enable and constrain the emergent forms of agency they enact. In other words, the affordances, as it's been called in this room. So thus a relational and dynamic analysis of platforms should be combined with an analysis of the emergent effects of its operations that we try to map. So just a preliminary analysis, and this is very preliminary, I should say. For our mapping, we will assess platforms based on the claims made by the developers and the providers, and on the substantiation of those claims with an eye on the kind of impact of their deployment. Our particular focus is on the systems that might alter or impact the contemporary warfare practices. So I'm sure we're all familiar with Project Maven. It is the epicenter of the US AI military efforts. Senior military officials recognized that the US could not rapidly develop military AI, and it found solutions in platform companies. Famously, Google quit after some turmoil, and now Palantir is taking over many of those operations. Initially, Project Maven was designed to enable the US military to apply computer vision, but it is an ever-evolving experiment being tested on the front lines these days, even in Ukraine and beyond. Palantir built on platforms that fulfill a variety of military functions. Here are some hand-picked or typical military functions that are not representative of any final data set we made. But indeed, Project Maven can be read as a recent instance of the recurring promise of a technological solution to an enduring military problem, namely situational awareness. Lucy Sukman's work is very important here, who says that Project Maven's aim is to turn the enormous volume of data available to the Department of Defense in the form of full motion video into actionable intelligence and insights at speed. And I guess this also relates to Annalenda's operational images. Beyond intelligence, then there's the command and control function, having the platform to coordinate all the military activities. So I quote a recent article from the New York Times about Project Maven, and starting quote, "From the US military's point of view, there is an ambition that the picture of the battlefield would flow to the soldiers in the trenches connected to phones or tablets," end quote. Or to quote Sukman again, "Intelligence is only prerequisite for action, to act of the killing, including the critical process of identifying who or what comprises of a legitimate target." But I don't want to stop there. I'm also quite interested in the economization stacks as Kaliskan formulated it. So since because there's a political economy side to this as well. So to focus on two examples of economization, so marketization and assetization. Marketization of scientific research and innovation, which seems like an old or the renowned military industrial complex model, which is the marketization movement that orients science and technology towards a market destiny or a commodity for sale. But I think it's more interesting also to look at what is now being called assetization of data and knowledge. So from Palantir's point of view, for example, data can be considered an asset. That is the transformation of something, in this case, data or knowledge, into a revenue generating and tradable resource. For at least two reasons. First, because it feeds the process of developing new services that will generate further engagement with the company and thus creates continuous revenue. Secondly, the data might eventually be purchased for very specific reasons by economic and military agents having access to the digital infrastructure necessary for its exploitation. So in conclusion, with stack militarization or stacks, I hope to describe the dynamism and the multiplicity of military practices that take place on these types of platforms. I think it does so perhaps better than any other available concept in order to map these types of, or make a mapping of these types of platforms. It allows us to isolate specific affordances of the platform works and study their consequences. And three points I want to make. It can also nuance some of the revolution talk around platforms, of which there's abundance in tech, but also in the military these days, which I think obscures more than it reveals. And it also, or we also hope to attend empirically to the processes that make and maintain new forms of militarization, how these novel networks propel old or new ways of thinking about and organizing the conduct of warfare. Such perspectives have also the potential to inform policy more effectively. It might lead us to imagine new avenues for military reform, for example, through regulation. These platform corporations strongly rely on technologies that are associated with datafication, surveillance, and new forms of prediction. Within warfare, accountability and legitimacy concerns are further amplified, especially when they are directed, when there are direct consequences for life. Such as in the case of lethal targeting. I will leave it with that. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to any feedback.
Jasper, anyways, thank you once again. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's fine now. It looks like the Zoom is working. Ça marche pas là?
No, I had a conference not so much time.
I think it's the internet connection. Bon, on fait son.
Silence.
Yes, I will.
with license to trade that is grounded in humanitarian principles. So humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and do no harm. And neutrality is key here. So neutrality, for those who are familiar with these terms, means that you're not taking sides in a conflict. That's what gives you license to trade, to cross front lines, and to provide life-saving assistance. And impartiality means that you're serving all the populations on the basis of need and not on the basis of any kind of affiliation, demographic or otherwise. So those are really important to keep in mind. And think with a thought of that, I wanted to explore how partnerships between big tech and aid agencies are posing threats to those principles and what that means for the overall license to trade and for humanitarian actors and the sector writ large. So the background, the need is rising. The estimates are mixed, but we could say something like 350, 60 million people in need of life-saving assistance, which is up 30% from last year. There are estimates that more than 1 billion people could be forcibly displaced by conflict and climate crises by 2050. It's a lot of people. And then, like the other international systems that we have that have sustained the sort of world order as we know it, those are increasingly under pressure, including the humanitarian ones. And it's facing two critical challenges. One is diminishing resources for support, as well as an increasing number of people who need that support. And the second one is decreasing compliance with international humanitarian law and these principles. And although the sort of development assistance has trended upwards largely, it's increasingly redirected to home territories, domestic territories, to fund migration and asylum work, potentially related to Ukraine, as well as for COVID. And while IHL and humanitarian principles have been under pressure for some time, violations have significantly increased in the last 10 years. So against this backdrop, humanitarians are saying, how do we do more with fixed or less resources? And they are turning, surprise, surprise, to technology and AI. So the use of technologies, including AI across the sector, are not surprising, I think, in terms of the use cases that are being explored. They're looking at trying to predict population movements at subnational levels, creating content related to reports and donor proposals, managing warehouses, volume forecasting, and trying to pre-position materials that you might need on the basis of cyclical events like floods and disasters. Security staff, much like intelligence staff, using it to analyze vast amounts of operational data to get better insights on risks and threats posed to humanitarian workers. And improved productivity, that's the sort of magic offer for Copilot and the like in terms of summarizing all our workflows on Teams and draft emails. And a lot of these are being offered for free or at very low cost by big tech. And big tech has said for a long time that AI is going to solve all of our problems, which is a big promise. Not only is it going to help sort of accelerate delivery against the sustainable development goals, but there's promises around trying to, get us to the very last mile of humanitarian delivery, humanitarian assistance. Big aid agencies like the World Food Program, WFP, or PAM for the French acronym, have signed strategic deals. There's up there the CIO of WFP announcing the deal that they formed with Palantir, amounting to the tune of estimated $45 million in pro bono software to improve their logistics and aid operations. Palantir has billed this as delivering life-saving assistance with WFP, which is interesting in terms of who's actually delivering the assistance. They've also announced a strategic partnership with the government of Ukraine about to help them with demining operations in the forthcoming 10 years. And Microsoft, most recently in the last month, has announced this sort of something called Team Rubicon, which is a veteran-led humanitarian organization focused on assisting communities before, during, and after disasters, and looking at how you leverage Copilot and Microsoft Dynamics 365 customer insights. And not to sound deeply cynical about that, but having worked in a lot of crises, that wouldn't necessarily be the first solution I'd be reaching towards. But what's interesting about that is when they say a veteran-led humanitarian organization, they mean former serving military, leading humanitarian efforts, which already for humanitarians is a bit of muddying waters in terms of the distinction between military and civilian personnel. And then Starlink, which had announced plans, obviously, to support connectivity to internationally recognized aid organizations in Gaza quite recently, and also has been quite punchy in terms of its role to provide internet to a number of humanitarian operations around the world. So they're providing a critical enabling impact for humanitarian operations. And so what's wrong with that? Why is that a problem? So they're far from neutral players, right? So going back to that principle of neutrality, in today's transnational conflicts and competition between the so-called great powers, they are not neutral players. And in fact, they're probably extensions of parties to conflict themselves. Alex Karp, the CEO of Palantir, speaks extensively about Palantir's work to support US Special Operations Forces and national security aims. And he talks about sort of shortening the kill chain. And as Marijn was saying as well, about trying to accelerate decision-making or making decisions faster in complex and high-pressure environments. He talks quite openly about Palantir being the critical enabler of the identification and execution of Osama bin Laden, and also helping the US government track down undocumented migrants in the United States. Microsoft often speaks more softly, but arguably carries a bigger stick when it comes to defending national security and military interests of the US. And then Starlink, in the interest of time, I won't go into it because you guys all know the stories of Starlink, but Starlink has been sort of unabashedly and actively involved in the tactical and operational successes of the war in Ukraine. And it has been, you could argue that it's been a deciding factor in some of those battles. And he's also, in his way, in his own special way, Elon is weighing in on strategic level debates on public referenda, on borders and territorial integrity, and arguably suggesting that he's taking a political side in a conflict. Not to suggest that it's always consistent or remains the same, but he certainly does takes certain sides. So if they aren't, it's hard to argue that they aren't playing a sort of decisive role in the outcome of these operational battles. And therefore, what's interesting is that that feels to me like they're a party to the conflict. Now, this isn't, sorry. This isn't new. None of this is new. And this is always my shout out for those of you who read Diana Forsyth, whose work in the 90s was sort of prophetic and very powerful to this day in terms of an anthropological view into science and technology studies. But it really mirrors very familiar trends. So the influence of corporations on governments and how they create policy. You know, for those historians in the room, it's always interesting to me that we have the Carnegie Foundation, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Rockefeller, Ford. Those names in the United States are now thought of great movers of philanthropy and humanitarian effort. And in the day, in the 19th century, they certainly did not have those meanings. And this is a very famous political cartoon, at least in US circles, around the influence of those monopolies and trusts and how they dominated political discourse and public institutions. There's also how the sort of co-option of science and technology for military and national security purpose. I mean, that's well-trodden territory and arguably goes back thousands of years, if not, you know, decades and tens of hundreds of years. There's a sort of co-option of MIT, Harvard, Princeton, Berkeley in the 40s and 50s for, you know, the Manhattan Project, but increasingly sort of DARPA, In-Q-Tel, the venture arm for the US intelligence community and Defense Department, as well as our own NSIF in the United Kingdom. There's a lot of ways in which the governments are trying to accelerate their grasp of or their growth of indigenous technology firms to advance their own national security advantages. There's the CSR PR tax benefits that come from partnering with humanitarian agencies. So there's sort of a corporate exploitation of humanitarian crises. And some firms, certainly like Palantir, who's always quoted in the papers as CIA-backed Palantir. I mean, they cannot shake it, even though that money from In-Q-Tel has come from decades ago. And then there's just the corporate power and profiteering. And I think one of the more sort of illuminating quotes in some of the research I've done has been Alex Karp's sales pitch about why they've intervened in Ukraine and given Ukraine this amazing platform for intelligence surveillance and target acquisition and verification, is that he's basically saying, the quote was, "You have a small country that galvanizes its country to bring the sort of Goliath to its knees, and they're up against this third most important army in the world, and they win. Then every single country in the world finds out and they ask, how did you do it? And how can we get that tool, basically?" So it's an amazing sales pitch. Palantir helps Ukraine bring Russia to its knees, and everyone comes to Palantir's door. So that to me is very interesting. And I guess the question is, well, so what? And this, for those humanitarians in the room, this came from the post-Nepal earthquake. And it was a sort of, tongue-in-cheek example of what humanitarian distributions often look like, which is sort of giving you a warm costume, but it's a pink bunny costume and it's not necessarily fit for purpose. And I would argue that that's sort of what's going on with technology, is that, they're not neutral players. They're playing both sides of the coin, but often playing all sides of the coin and constantly flipping. So not only are they supporting humanitarian agencies and parties to conflict, but they're supporting the US and maybe potentially actors that are hostile to US interests. And that sort of echoes very sound investment in business strategies, and they've got lots of irons in the fire. So let's see which ones work out. So why is that problematic for humanitarians? Well, I would argue it adds, increased risks to their reputation. They become complicit in the increased and expanded surveillance of refugees and asylum seekers. And to your point before about the sort of the pervasive nature of surveillance in today's modern warfare and hybrid warfare, there is the lines between pre and post conflict, what is actually happening in theater, in operations, and what is then a post-conflict environment. Those lines do not exist the way they did in a pre-9/11 environment. And I think that that's where the risks around extended humanitarian surveillance blending into military surveillance becomes exceptionally high. And it also weakens accountability. So when things go wrong, like Palantir's AIP, and they're not trained on civilian objects, and civilian objects and humanitarian agencies are identified and removed or are killed in theater, who's to blame? I mean, is it the humanitarians? Is it the people deploying that technology? Is it the operator in theater? And I think the whole idea of accountability is really at risk. Are there ways to make it better? Potentially, I think they could go along. I think it's on the humanitarians to be very clear on whom they take donations for, including in-kind technology donations and software donations. I think they need to be much better about their risk assessments and treatment plans. I think they're being, frankly, and in my own view, very naive about the relationships that they're brokering with arguably some of the more powerful private sector firms on the planet, whereas their relationships with things like tobacco firms and arms firms, companies, are pretty clear. I think there's now a need for them to re-examine what their ethical principles are and reconsider how they approach and broker those relationships with those firms. Now, is it better than nothing? I think, as I was saying in the break to someone, I think it's to Gavin, I think it's there are very narrow use cases where these technologies will be transformational. Médecins Sans Frontières is doing some very interesting work. But I think the whole scale adoption of some of these technologies from firms that are playing active roles in conflicts does more harm than it does good.
Well, thank you for this quite pessimistic assessment, but I think we all understood actually all your messages. Just we'll give the floor to Matti Pohjonen. So you are a senior researcher with the University of Helsinki in Finland. and you're going to focus on a comparative analysis of two case studies with the involvement of big tech players into the Ukrainian war and another battlefield, which is the Tigrayan war in Ethiopia. So, which is a very interesting case study because it helps us also to decenter from the, I would say, more familiar battlefield. So here it's very useful for all of us, and you will also think to develop on the moderation related, involvement by these companies on these two security issues. Floor is yours.
Thank you. And I know it's been a long day today, so let's try to keep a little bit of energies up until the last presentation. I'll also try to keep this presentation relatively short, so we will have more time for discussion. So many of the points, rather than lecturing here, we can also raise up in the discussion section that follows. But first, thanks everybody for inviting me here, and I'm very happy to follow such an established set of panelists, and hopefully some of the comparative perspectives that I'm trying to bring in this presentation will start to make sense towards the end of it. And this is a collaborative paper we have been working on, or a project we have been working with Professor Pantti at the University of Helsinki, but unfortunately she could not be here. So I'm building a lot on her analysis and on her work on this paper as well. And then, so hopefully I will also represent what she has been doing in an accurate way. But so we have about 10-15 minutes. I'll try to keep it within that range, and then we can move on to the final one, just to kind of keep time for discussion. So again, who we are and why are we here? So among the other many things that I have been working on in the last number of years, we have a project that has been funded by the Finnish Academy, or the Academy of Finland. Is called Media Platforms and Social Accountability, a term that was used already in this panel, Dynamics, Practice and Discourses, which has been looking at the kind of debates on social accountability around digital platforms, and digital platforms meaning more broadly, but also specifically focusing on social media platforms, or how these platforms are held, or the practices, the dynamics of them being held accountable in different global contexts. And part of the work that I have been doing is I have been looking at this from a very global comparative perspective. And there's, of course, a bigger team working on these things, and I work on a number of other things as well. But so this is a collaboration, and the project has been led by Professor Pantti. And just to kind of introduce her background into this, the work that we have been doing. She's a professor of media and communication studies at the University of Helsinki, and has worked a lot on the kind of extensively on the role of media in shaping public life. But more specifically, I think for the presentation here is that she has been working on a lot on trying to understand the relationship between media and war in Ukraine, including a recent book that was published, which was quite, what do you call, quite obviously called Media and War in Ukraine. And so we wrote a chapter for this book, which was relatively, because when you have a crisis event happening, the deadlines are quite quick for getting things out as quickly as possible. So we wrote a book, or we wrote a chapter with Professor Pantti on social media platforms responding to the invasion of Ukraine, where we're looking at what are the kind of rhetorical tropes and rhetorical ways that the social media platforms have been trying to justify, discuss, or explain their involvement in the kind of different decisions they have been making about Ukraine. So this paper that, or the presentation I'm building on, then builds on the work that we have been doing on this chapter and some of the other work, and compares that then to another research topic that I have been working on for probably about 10 years so, which is looking at digital politics in global comparative context, and specifically East Africa and Ethiopia. And I have been doing a lot of work for various projects recently on the Tigray war, which most of you might have heard about, but it's not something that has been gaining so much public attention in comparison, for instance, to the Ukraine war. And as a humanitarian worker, you are probably well aware that Tigray war was a quite of intense. I'll talk about that a bit more later. And so part of that work, we were thinking that we should compare then these two different case studies, which are both very high-profile conflicts and wars that have been taking place almost simultaneously, with some time lags and time differences, and to see, has there been some differences building on the initial article focusing on Ukraine? Has there been some differences in how the platform responses to two significantly different types of context? how they've been responding, discussing, or trying to legitimize their actions, and both having quite high profile in debates on content moderation and debates on platform accountability. So this kind of forms the basis for the research that we have been doing, which is now a paper that we're working on, and eventually, hopefully, we'll get into and some of the research is still preliminary, but we'll discuss some of the ways we have then started trying to narrate and articulate. If we would take this global comparative perspective and try to understand what might be the questions and issues we might want to raise in this framework. So again, very simple starting point. And again, I will take it as that most people at least have heard about the Tigray War. So I won't go too much into the context of it. But so the starting point is that, in a way, building up on the last 2 days of discussions, that platforms or digital platforms, they play a crucial role in geopolitical conflicts and wars of the 21st century, which is the premise of the entire conference that we are attending. But there are, however, and we wanted to focus that there are significant differences in how this happens in different global contexts, or focusing more on there are significant inequalities on how this happens in different global contexts. So in a way, the starting point that we're bringing into this comparative analysis is that the role of digital platforms in war is thus related to both changing geopolitical situations that we have been seeing across many presentations already, but also this kind of pervasive or persisting global inequalities in digital platform economy and governance. And one point of contention, or one thing that provides a good point of entry into this debate, is debates on social media content moderation, which you already saw in one of the presentations of Brazil today, which was discussing which in the kind of literature on social media content moderation points to some of the ideological choices embedded into the platform companies' policies and practices, and how they try to justify them. And you can see some examples from news articles about the discourse that has been emerging around the Tigray conflict and some of the other conflicts in Africa, around the failures of Twitter and failures of content moderation. And there are very significantly different histories, but I can maybe highlight this a bit later, and how there's been similar language being used both in the case of Ukraine war as well as some other conflicts. So what do we do, or what types of research questions? And this is a very relatively focused paper that we have been working on, but the project is more encompassing. So we have multiple other research strands that we are focusing on as well. So we were interested in exploring how digital platforms position themselves, or alternatively were positioned as actors in two different kinds of conflicts. A very simple starting premise: Russian war, 2022 ongoing, the Tigray war in Ethiopia, 2020, and around there was some overlap between the two different conflicts. And in a way, question one, through what types of communicative strategies did digital platforms try to communicate their position as actors, neutral or active or otherwise, during these different transnational conflicts? And in a way, explore how this positioning was informed by pressure from civil society activists and governments campaigning to hold or somehow keep digital platforms accountable, focusing specifically on social media content moderation and debates around that. And so we're okay, let's try to figure out, we have this two interesting case studies. What can we find out? What types of information is out there that allows us to start looking at the explanations of the rhetoric used by social media platforms, and especially in their kind of public speeches and various outputs. So what we did, and so we had, again, you are always linked or restricted the type of data you have available. And so we ended up then scraping, as part of the broader MAPS project, we scraped all the corporate media posts or the blog posts of all the major platforms. So we have done YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, Microsoft Meta, LinkedIn, Google, Apple, and Amazon, and these have been labeled also for relevant themes. So we have quite an extensive archive of all the kind of external blog posts and where these companies have been justifying their perspectives and actions and using certain types of language. We also selected all the major accounts from Twitter, all the major corporate accounts of all the major Twitter digital platforms, and we downloaded all the tweets that were available before Musk unfortunately shut down the API. So we were able to get a historical archive of all the tweets from 2013, even further backwards onwards. And you can start seeing some of the patterns emerge in terms of how these were mentioned and how they were being discussed in various both online communications, social media communication, but then also in the blog posts. And then we have done a lot of extensive English language news articles and civil society reports around the topic, partially for the reason that there is quite scarce material that actually has discussed Ethiopia directly. So we have been supplementing that with using various types of civil society reports. And as we know, in the humanitarian sector, there is a lot of work that has been done, which is more on like civil society rather than the kind of political debates around that. and methods which we are still exploring. For this one, we decided to take a case study approach and use a mixed method computational analysis with qualitative discourse analysis. I'll mostly talk about the qualitative discourse analysis because that's a bit more straightforward, but it'll show some of the themes and some of the perspectives that we're trying to bring into this research. So again, just to show fancy graphs, and this is just digital method stuff. So we can see there's all kinds of a big spike has taken place both in Ethiopia and Ukraine towards the big conflict. If you look at all the platform posts, you can see some of the platforms that have been most actively discussing them. You can see how in the case of Ukraine, there was a much bigger spike of discussions or blog posts by the major platforms in 2022. So there were 77 written about the Ukraine war once it started. In the case of Ethiopia, when the war started, there was 11 of them. However, most of them ended up being about Instagram influencers and how good Ethiopian food is. So there were only a number of cases that actually talked about the kind of moderating content and preventing genocide and hate speech that tends to be often discussed in these cases. And so again, overall findings, and I'm going to then discuss some of the more broader theoretical things towards the end of the presentation. But so we argued in the chapter on the Ukraine war, and I think this theme has come across in quite a few presentations already. In the chapter on the social media responses to the Ukraine war, we argued that the Russian war in Ukraine represents perhaps for the first time where there was a geopolitical alignment, a term we're using, between platforms and governments. And for the first time, it has extended to major geopolitical players such as Russia. So many of the social media platforms, for various reasons, became actively aligned or involved as actors in the Ukraine war, doing things like banning different Russian accounts, including at times allowing violent speech on the platform, which was not enabled elsewhere. Whereas in the case of Ethiopia, it still remains the rhetoric that has come out, or the way it's been discussed, has focused, again, in the very humanitarian language here, which was, I think, very good that it followed this, has focused on neutrality and objectivity and moderating and hateful and misleading content, and hate speech becoming a very central term, how this operates. And there has been a very big focus on the word safety, or the use of safety as a term, that the role of platforms is not to get involved, but is to keep people safe and as an external, neutral, objective moderator. And so this has often been also in response in countries like Ethiopia, in response to global civil society criticism. So there's a narrative of Myanmar, genocide, hate speech, Facebook, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka maybe gets a mention in between. And especially with the Frances Haugen revelation from Meta, who used Ethiopia as one of the examples. Ethiopia has become quite symbolic in the failures of social media platforms in moderating hateful speech in the comparative global south context. So we were building on this and looking at the previous work and started comparing how could we then identify some potential thematic differences in how we could start approaching this kind of comparative differences between, on the one hand, alignment, more close relations versus the older humanitarian neutral safety discourse. So we came up with 3 different themes that we are now exploring and kind of looking more specifically into the data itself. So the first theme, and I'll show a few examples of this before I'll go to the final conclusion. The first theme is that there is a kind of a difference or dichotomy between protecting democracy. And in the case of Ukraine, the platforms took a very active role that we have to protect democracy against foreign threats. Versus in the case of Ethiopia, we are not dealing with democracy, we are neutral, we are protecting the safety of users and individuals. And in the kind of content moderation, classical debate. There was also this kind of dichotomy between engagement, that they actively engage with both Ukrainian and the EU government, who gave a lot of pressure to the major platforms or social media platforms. Whereas in the case of Ethiopia, and now you could argue that this extends to many other countries in the global south context, would be also neutrality and distance or kind of remoteness, that there is neutrality, we don't want to get involved, but also we don't want to get too close with the various conflict parties. And one of the best anecdotal quotes I ever got was from one high-ranking politician in the Ethiopian government, and he said that Meta or Facebook, we neither have the carrot nor the stick, so we can't influence them financially because there's no interest, nor punitively. So it's very hard to kind of get them to pay attention to what is going on within that context. So there's a kind of distance or remoteness, and you can see that in some of the narratives that I have been exploring. And then a kind of a new one we have been thinking about is that, again, I'm not sure how this dichotomy works, but it's about expanding opportunities, that there was also an attempt by major platforms to expand beyond the typical roles to various other types of domains in cybersecurity, also expanding into like humanitarian work, expanding to providing schools and computers and software. And whereas in the case of, and as a kind of a more proactive response to getting involved, whereas in the case of Ethiopia, it was more reputation control or responding to civil society responses or criticisms. So on that framework, a few examples, these are just quotes that we have been picking up from various kind of external communication. So here's, for instance, from Google and Alphabet. Even before the invasion of Ukraine, there had been a worrying signs that democracy was under assault. But first, let's talk about why that partnership is so critically important. Technology can also benefit democracy itself. So democracy, technology sides in protecting democracy against external threats kind of emerges an interesting narrative. On the case of Ethiopia, the safety narrative, we have moved Ethiopia to the category of countries that we believe are at the highest risk for conflict and violence, so on and so forth, that we can have a long-term strategy of keeping people safe. So kind of external mediation of being able, not being involved, but keeping people safe in who are using the platforms. And again, this is, a lot of these things are pre-Musk, so there has been very little that happened after Musk in terms of, I don't think it has even been his radar since that, but that was before Musk. Many of the kind of Twitter comments were there. So again, another example, just going into engagement versus distance neutrality. So I'm just using the example of here, Facebook allows war posts urging violence against Russian invaders. A lot of debate around that is it justified, or can you postpone some of your usual policies? And again, there's questions about how war in Ukraine roiled Facebook and Instagram and over what type of content was permitted, and causing some confusion in the companies. A lot of newspaper articles wrote about this, and again, social media wasn't ready for this one. There needs a plan of how to engage. Whereas in the case of Ethiopia, almost boilerplate language of, we aim to enforce our rules as equitably and even-handedly as possible. Our first priority is the safety of the people on Twitter and those on the ground. Our rules are enforced objectively on content and accounts. We remain neutral to political identity and ideology. So you can see a very striking kind of contrast here again. And so on and so forth. So we can do the expanding opportunity reputation control. And again, we are helping teachers keep teaching. Google is working with the ministry. They're also providing hardware, software, content, and training to ensure these devices make the best possible impact, working with local organizations. And then a lot of critical kind of Meta being sued for $1.6 billion for fueling ethnic violence. The Facebook papers reveal a staggering failure of content moderation. Open letter to Facebook from Access Now about violence inciting speech, and so on and so forth. So these are the kind of three themes that now we're trying to structure some of our arguments of how we can then start looking at comparatively about geopolitical alignment, positioning in global south and other contexts, and see if that applies potentially to also other comparative case studies. And obviously there's very scant information. We could look at Myanmar as an example of how they've been also trying to articulate their involvement in Myanmar. But just to keep things within the time frame, I'll conclude at this point. So in a way, how do we then approach the question of platforms as geopolitical actors? And why might some of this be also interesting or important in the kind of broader theoretical sense of what has been going on? And so in a way, one of the things that this kind of comparative analysis shows clearly the differences in the geopolitical positioning of digital platforms in global conflicts. And one of the research projects we had on extreme speech was looking at like global contextual framings. So the idea is that there is a positioning, but it differs from where you're positioned. And so from the global south, the positioning looks very different versus from Ukrainian context, that this has consequences. Again, maybe there's a growing alignment of social media platforms to different geopolitical interests. Again, how that happens is, of course, depending on where you're positioned. Again, why this potentially matters is that there has been a lot of critique about the perceived legitimacy of platforms as mediators of political information. And this has become increasingly questioned in different global conflicts. Together with generative AI, together with the trust issue, now platforms are often seen in the context of Ethiopia as failing, not being able to take sides with, being hypocritical, not giving enough attention. So there's this kind of growing criticism, which might as well play into the hands of Russian Chinese companies as well. Because if you stop trusting the neutrality of the policies that are being done, then it becomes just about either perception warfare and what else. And again, this perception can have significant consequences to how digital platforms are perceived in conflict and war, or this shift in perception. And you can see things like TikTok, YouTube bans have become increasingly, internet shutdowns have become one of the very popular debates in the different countries of the global south. And there's kind of weaponization of social media platforms and their content moderation that has been I've been exploring somewhere also. So I think I'll conclude here, and maybe we can then open up for some discussions as well. So in a way, the reason I started with the question that how many of you have heard about Tigray War, that it was during the two-year conflict, I think the casualty rates were about 600,000 combatants killed. So in numbers, it is a very expansive war. So this is from Electronic Frontier Foundation. So, and the way they kind of summarize some of the debates or using the words that they use is that while we recognize the efforts of tech companies to uphold democracy and human rights in Ukraine, we call for long-term investment in human rights accountability and a transparent, equal, and consistent application of policies to uphold the rights of users worldwide. Once platforms began to take action in Ukraine, they took extraordinary steps that they have been unwilling to take elsewhere. And in a humanitarian framework, this is about neutrality and various things which can have significant consequences also in the geopolitical context. So I will stop there, and I'm within the 20 minutes. So.
Well, thank you so much, Matti. Well, your talk actually is pretty much complementary of what Tobias will to deal with. Tobias Liebetrau, you are a researcher at the Department of Political Science with the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and you're going to analyze the different roles some of these big tech companies have sought to play in warfare. And you will talk, of course, about Ukraine, and you have the floor.
Thank you. I'll also try to do this brief, so we actually have time for the discussion. I think a couple of my fellow panelists are leaving in 20 minutes or so. So I'll try to keep it at 10 minutes. So I'll jump a bit of the more, I think, theoretical framework stuff and spend some more time on the empirics. But a bit of background, this paper is a draft paper still, so it's very much ongoing research. It's co-authored with my colleague Jeppe from the Danish Defence College, who sadly couldn't be here today. And we have both been working on big tech, but mainly within the area of cybersecurity. But then looking at what is going on in Ukraine, decided to write a paper on big tech and IR more broadly and security studies. So that's sort of the background of the paper. So it starts from an observation that big tech companies have provided unprecedented support for Ukraine following Russia's invasion. Microsoft and Amazon moved Ukraine's IT infrastructure to their cloud. Google has provided free licensing of its products. Microsoft, Google, and Pantti have remained key players, sharing data on Russian cyber activities and assisting with endpoint protection. SpaceX has provided internet connection, but also curbed the Ukraine use of Starlink for military drone usage. So what does all of this tell us about big tech in war specifically and international politics more broadly? Do we perhaps even need to rethink the role of business in IR in the digital age, looking at these companies and how they intervene in the war in Ukraine? Answering these questions, we try to develop an analytical framework around the concept of infrastructural power to understand how public-private relations are established, negotiated, transformed through infrastructural operations, constituting a source of power for big tech companies. So to explore the influence of these big tech companies through the concept of infrastructural power, we primarily connect with IR scholarship on global governance and security studies, who have obviously explored public-private relations and how they matter for IR for years. And we identify sort of three overall waves of scholarship. The first, questioning the primacy of the state as an object of research, as an actor on the international stage. The second, demonstrating how private companies have autonomous security authority. I mean, this is very sort of headline mode. And then a third, and scholarship that we tie into is one where the public-private distinction is seen as not a distinction actually, but two sides that are intertwined. They are entangled, they are enmeshed, they are co-produced. A lot of work has explored that, especially in critical security studies and global governance by some of the people present in the room and in the panel. So that's sort of the literature that we try to advance and tap into by developing this infrastructural power approach. So theorizing infrastructural power of big tech, we repurposed the concept of infrastructural power from Michael Mann, who used it to explore the power of the state, but other people have helped us here already exploring non-state actors and their infrastructural power, mainly within the international political economy. But also people slowly in media studies, communication studies have actually started using the concept to explore big tech. And overall, I think that this concept helps us to do three things. And the first is to account for the political importance of big tech companies owning and operating key socio-technical infrastructures of the digital age. Sort of unpacking that, we draw on science and technology studies, geography, anthropology, and now also sort of a wave of IR studies exploring infrastructuring, infrastructuralism, how infrastructures are processual, assemblages, social material, and so on. Second, because this is also sort of a little bit of a research agenda argument and a way to sort of study a big tech in IR, we also argue that it helps us to accommodate opening new research agendas, re-problematizing and reimagining politics, and that's quoting Anna's work on infrastructuring. And then lastly, it allows us to empirically situate reconfigurations of public-private relations through infrastructural operations. And with that final and third point comes the idea that while infrastructural power provides an conceptual anchor for understanding rearrangements of public-private relations and the workings of power, we do not take it to be one overarching logic or explanatory principle that explains sort of everything empirical away. Rather, the concept will allow us to inquire into the partial ways in which infrastructural operations reconfigure public-private relations. So to ground our empirical analysis of how infrastructural power is expressed in the war in Ukraine, we engage with three sides of infrastructural operations, again, to underline sort of the processual, assemblaged idea of infrastructure. And as I think it was Jasper saying earlier, that it's exactly not an object, it's something that is emerging, it's processual. We look at storage, flows, and knowledge, enabling us to demonstrate how these reconfigure public-private relations, constituting a source of power for big tech. So these are by no means sort of exclusive dimensions or characteristics, but support a more fine-grained conceptualization of the specific infrastructural operations at play in the war in Ukraine. As I said, these three sides are storage, flows, and knowledge, and this is sort of their more empirical dimension. So what is it? Why is it important? And then in the paper, we also try to unpack in a more theoretical note what these infrastructures, they do, sort of how do they then tie into public-private relations. And we do that in terms of cloud by the work of Louisa Moore, also Benjamin Braddon, people especially in geography who have written on this. Related to flows, we draw mainly on media studies and communication studies and draw on the concept of responsibilization. So a little bit more of the platform studies literature, you could say. Then on knowledge, we tie in with the epistemic infrastructure discussions in science and technology studies, but also in IR, but also in geography. People have started exploring the epistemic infrastructural power of these big tech companies, perhaps mainly through the material side of the infrastructure coin, but still that is just to situate it a little bit more. So that's how the more analytical strategy part of this conceptualization and what it looks like. But I'll jump to sort of our empirical discussions, because I think that's the most interesting and what I would also love to discuss with you the most. And I'll stick to only two of the three, and that is the storage, clouding of sovereignty first. So one of the most important pre-war decisions taken by the Ukrainian government happened 1 week before the invasion, when the parliament signed into law a bill that allowed the information transfer of government data and certain private data. So on the day of the invasion, Amazon and the Ukrainian government sketched out a plan to transfer critical data from Ukrainian ministries and essential private companies to the cloud of Amazon. So the transfer of data was an intricate process relying on Amazon's existing logistical chain in Europe, AWS Snowballs. Sort of the physical devices capable of storing a petabyte of encrypted data were flown from Dublin to Krakow and then transported across the border into Ukraine, where data was uploaded before the devices were shipped back to an unknown Amazon location. And once uploaded to the cloud, the data was then distributed across Amazon's global cloud infrastructure and was no longer threatened by Russian missiles. And a similar story is told by Microsoft on their support to Ukraine. So through the analytical lens of infrastructural power, the process of moving critical data to the cloud highlights the reconfiguration of not only the distinction between public and private and how this is being renegotiated, but also a physical and a virtual distinction is at play. As Amazon and Microsoft continue to iterate, the existence of cloud infrastructures enables sovereign governments at the brink of war to ensure the continuing operation of their own vital communication networks. But it comes with a price, the reshaping of spatio-political conditions of sovereignty. A government's decision to move data to the virtual cloud is in practical terms an exercise in moving physical hard disks to physical data centers in other countries. And such territorializing clouds, you could say, speak to how sovereignty is being disturbed in terms of control of data. So Ukraine may subscribe to Amazon as a cloud service provider while maintaining ownership on its data on the one hand. Amazon is at the same time subjected to US Cloud Act as well as various European regulations according to where these data centers are located and the Ukrainian cloud being distributed. So both legislative measures hold the power to request information from Amazon data centers. So these cloud infrastructures create multiple sovereignties and subsequently potentially conflicting sovereignty claims. But that's something that could then play out in court and in another sort of political sites. In war, such multiple sovereigns have implications for many of the states involved. So the virtual material distribution of cloud infrastructures enable data essential for military operations to be stored and processed in other states. In that sense, Amazon data centers in Germany, Switzerland, or Ireland hold data that enable Ukraine's war machine, data that then becomes legitimate military targets. So while Amazon spokespersons are probably right that such data is likely outside the reach of Russian missiles, they are so. First, because the reterritorialization of the cloud as data centers in NATO countries have de facto placed Ukraine under the NATO deterrence umbrella. And second, because the data is stored on servers alongside or hidden amongst civilian data, likely from all over the world, whose destruction would cause much collateral damage. Not only very meticulous and very carefully crafted cyber attacks that have traced the Ukrainian data traffic to particular data centers will be able to discriminate sufficiently between civilian and military data. So cyber attacks have also will be extremely, extremely difficult to carry out against these data centers without risking a lot of collateral damage. So in other words, Russia cannot meaningfully attack vital parts of Ukrainian infrastructure as well as defense infrastructure without seriously risking causing a destruction on NATO territory and thereby also causing at least a risk of escalation. So the security and defense implications go to the heart of IR scholarship in terms of the state's ability to control its own territory, ability to deter adversaries, and ability to seek security through alliance politics. To just sort of mention a few of the consequences of this infrastructural power and the renegotiation of public-private relations. Second, very brief on Microsoft. Microsoft have been, again, very active in supporting Ukraine when it comes to cybersecurity, and the infrastructural operations of cybersecurity have turned Microsoft into a gatekeeper of knowledge about the war. So a form of epistemic infrastructural power the company has embraced mainly in two ways. First, it has allowed Microsoft to position itself as a truth teller of war. The company has published several very well-designed and nicely presented reports on what they see of Russian cyber activity against Ukraine. And the reports have become very authoritative and very much cited pieces, at least in the public debate around discussions on cyber war or not, cybersecurity activities in Ukraine. So Microsoft is definitely taking the initiative there through this infrastructure. Second, Microsoft has demonstrated how to protect Ukraine's digital infrastructure more actively. So Microsoft Digital Security Unit have become remote partners with Ukrainian cybersecurity officials, providing not only threat intelligence, but also offering free services, including a 24/7 cybersecurity hotline to actively block and eradicate malicious code. So the company's infrastructural power has made it an invaluable expert of network defense in war, but this expertise is deployed only virtually from remote and secure locations, again inside NATO territory. The deployment of actual hunt-forward cyber teams on the ground is left to government entities from the US and the UK mainly. So much of cybersecurity expertise today is virtually deployable, which enables Microsoft to navigate these murky legal waters on the status of the company and its employees when they're actively fighting with Ukraine against Russia in cyberspace. So the understanding of epistemic infrastructural power as the capacity to virtually deploy expertise points to the pressing problem of accountability on the one hand, and the implications for interactions among allied states on the other, because obviously all of this data that Microsoft now sources in Ukraine have implications for other countries' dependencies on Microsoft outside of Ukraine. By collecting and analyzing threat data, Microsoft is not only helping Ukraine, but also in a way help protecting its own business in cyberspace. So they're also helping their global customers by identifying signatures of attacks and so on. So Microsoft can improve their software as well as their cybersecurity services. So Microsoft may aid Ukraine for free, but by being both a global software and cybersecurity provider, Microsoft also improves their own services by collecting these data. And that only strengthens Microsoft's ability to extract rent from users of its software and additional rent from the same users for protecting the insecure software that the users are renting in the first place. So Microsoft is not only providing the solutions to existing threats, but are productive of the threats that they offer solutions for. So they're producing vulnerable digital assets that states rely upon. And for some years, policymakers have complained about this fact and that it becomes increasingly impossible not to subordinate oneself to the system and rent the latest, more secure version of Microsoft services. So after the war in Ukraine, this dependency has just increased. And then a last dilemma arises that a lot of states might even compete for the help should a war break out, should the escalation actually come true and Russia invade more NATO countries. All countries would have to look at Microsoft and ask for their help. And so Microsoft would have to choose, or the NATO members would have to agree on who should be helped by Microsoft and how. So there's also this destabilizing factor when it comes to the NATO alliance at play. And I will skip the preliminary conclusions and just leave them there because they are very preliminary and very open. So they might just be sort of a ground for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tobias, and to all of you. So we have only a few minutes left to open the Q&A session. So would you have any questions in the audience? No way.
Thank you very much for these very interesting presentations, all of you. So my question would be for all of you, because you all talked about these topics, but I'm very curious about the fact that these platforms are taking the side of states in this conflict, but are they negotiating this relationship with the military? I mean, the possible pushbacks that this kind of cooperation could create in the decades to come could be that, for example, China could use this event in their narrative of double standards to push for showing that these kind of technologies are also not neutral on the US side and from other companies. So don't they think that what they are doing now in Ukraine could actually push for more decoupling, and that it could help some other regimes' narratives? Is this something that they think about, or do they just think that, okay, people will ask for our solutions, we are testing the ground, and finally everybody will want our security solutions? Is it something that they are thinking about, or not really? Thank you.
Just building on my questions to add something to all of you as well. You were talking about geopolitical alignment, especially within the context of the Ukrainian war. But what the potential of geopolitical friction here, especially when you refer to the China-Taiwan, Russian conflict and so on. So perhaps you might choose to answer questions here you would like to deal with.
I'll go for your question, because I think it's an interesting development taking place where we see, in fact, that especially the US-based platform corporations are increasingly open about their collaboration with the US military and with Western militaries more generally, and that they're really open about taking sides increasingly, right? So with the beginning of Project Maven and the whole controversy with Google being involved, we see sort of a pushback and Google saying, oh, we're a neutral company and we won't engage in these kinds of relationships anymore. Well, now we're so many years further, and I think we see increasingly that companies, especially those like Volunteer, are actually very much producing the same discourse, the same geopolitical rivalry discourse that we see within Washington or the Pentagon. So I would say that it's increasingly sort of normalized to for these companies also to speak about this geopolitical rivalry and to say that it's needed now in this particular context to take sides.
That is a very strange sound. Maybe I'll add on top of that. I don't know if it's being discussed. It's not something that I've looked at, but I think from my perspective, I think a good thing to keep in mind is that the battle for mines is not fought in Europe. For the most part, it's fought in other parts of the world. And that's where it makes sense to actually have a lot more disinformation push, kind of information warfare. So when somebody did some preliminary research when the Ukraine invasion started, there was a significant drop in the amount of disinformation coming to Europe, but it increased at the same time in Africa and other parts, because that's where the legitimacy question is much more important. So if you look at it from this perspective, by geopolitically aligning with very explicitly with the European context, it just plays into a narrative which we're now seeing playing out in West Africa and other parts where many governments are in fact siding with Russia or with the kind of anti-imperial forces in the kind of almost cliche rhetoric they're using. And it's very actively also being promoted. So by being non-neutral, you're actually buying into the narrative that, okay, it's a post-colonial extension of they've been screwing us over for the last 150 years and they're still doing it. And that's it happened in the Gaza conflict, exactly the same narrative is being played out. So I think that's something that it would be good to also keep in mind.
Just the other thing to say from a sort of like pragmatic, not as the non-academic, is that these relationships and interstate relationships between states are incredibly dynamic and changing all the time. And I think the US-China one is very interesting to watch because it has a cyclical cooling and warming function to it. And if you think about Eric Schmidt being in China in 2017 with the AlphaGo test, his relationship or the way in which he presented himself in Google was quite warm. And fast forward to today, and he's presenting at congressional committees about the Chinese Communist parties. He's testifying about political entities within China, not technology and not sort of geopolitics of technology, but he's talking about political entities, and that, you know, his reach into the US think tank world is very interesting. And, you know, Alex Karp Palantir is also co-funding the AI Expo next week. And so, like, you know, it gets very interesting and murky. But I guess just in terms of whether or not you see how that plays out into some of these more sort of reactions from states that might be seen as hostile actors, there's like multiple dimensions happening, and the diplomatic relationships that are the foundation for how these states communicate in the first place mirrors sometimes what's going on in technology, but sometimes it's a bit of smoke and mirrors up here, and then there's like really interesting sort of third secretary level conversations going on that aren't necessarily impacted by those dynamics.
Thank you so much for such an interesting panel. We've heard throughout the day about how governments are, in a variety of ways, finding themselves reliant on these platforms, whether that be through Twitter for their digital diplomacy or through the submarine cable infrastructure. And I know that we've spoken about the involvement of digital platforms in conflict on this panel as sort of free services and one that's more of a sales pitch and this sort of thing. But I'm curious about thoughts from the panel about the trajectory of this and whether there'd be a scenario which got alluded to at the end in terms of governments having to compete for Microsoft's help, for example, where there's a bit of a bait and switch and suddenly, like the Starlink situation, it becomes a cost for services. And is this what the new military industrial complex looks like, where incentives for companies to create conflict that they can be the service providers of is established? Thank you.
Have to leave afterwards, sorry. Just very quickly, I think, one of the things, of course, that we see in different domains is this infrastructuralization of platforms that Jasper was talking about, right? So the sort of expanding tentacles of big tech in all these different domains, the ways in which their platforms and practices really transgress into many domains of social life and also intersect in various ways. And my interest also in the military is that I think it's somehow different because it is the place where the state is still the strongest, right? And where questions of sovereignty are still very, and just, yeah, the importance of survival just very strongly present still. But also there, I think, with these developments that we're seeing today, obviously with the Starlink being a pivotal example, we also see this infrastructuralization taking place, right? So that it becomes very difficult not to be dependent on some of these global corporations. But I do think that the relationships will be more complex actually in this domain, and that therefore it's very important in the coming years to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I agree very much. And I think the Starlink case is actually a very good example, even though it was the one I skipped in our paper, because I think that it exactly shows how, in a way, this public-private relation in the case of Starlink becomes this constant oscillation between governing through responsibilization of Starlink and Elon Musk and governing through contracting. And that the US kind of keeps and the company itself also sort of moving from one side to the other, or like in the way it's being argued, at least in the public discourse around what should Starlink do, why should they do it, and what is the role of the US government, especially in this case. So yes, I think that that's something we'll see more of in the future, and probably being both and so both sort of traditional contracting, but also additional ways of responsibilization of these companies, and finding non-contractual ways of then trying to steer it or stabilize it from the government side.
Yeah, thank you for your question. And this is, I want to link it to my presentation as well. This is why I think it's very important also to talk about economization and in my own words, in different types of stacks, right? And I try to like distinguish between marketization stacks, or whatever we call it, and assetization, right? And because like the marketization is more like you produce a technology and you put it on sale, and that's kind of like how it's valued. Whereas with assetization, it's the data collection itself that it has a valuation process to it. And it's very interesting what you say in how that might evolve differently when geopolitics gets in the way or gets involved, right? And I don't have an answer to that, but it's something, yeah, that I find very productive for my thinking. Yeah, thank you.
Other question from the audience, yeah, please.
Sorry, competing microphone. So thanks a lot. Super interesting panel, and thanks for bringing in both Ethiopian humanitarianism that I see is running off the stage, escaping the no. Okay, so I have a question which I'd also like to pose as one of these questions to the panel. Because I think it's a very, in many ways, a very unitary because you really do speak about platform stacks, infrastructures, and I'd like to pose the question of, where's the scope for for resisting the kinds of practices you're talking about? And I'm thinking, so, you know, the argument about Ethiopia being excluded, not all get the same. Could we please have some attention to what's going on beyond the Western world? Basically, very, very justified and well taken, of course, and poses the question: well, where could the agency come from to impose that? And is the platform format, does it lend itself to this now? So Marijn is gone, but I think it's very interesting. There's been an interesting work actually on using Scott and contrasting possibilities of resisting the way we're used to thinking about resistance, you know, from below, and what happens in a platform world where all that is already integrated into the platform discourse. But then, of course, you end up in a space where it's very complicated to find other forms of resistance. They said if everything is just a platform or everything is included and we listen to everyone and there's a whatever multi-stakeholder, that would be the sort of humanitarian consultation of everyone involved, and we'll hear all voices and then ignore them, or we might produce a prototype and then ignore that, whatever we do. So I'm wondering about this for all of you. Sorry, I hope it's clear what I'm asking for. And I think it poses that, like, the stack, it's exactly the same. Tobias, very similar in terms of thinking how you might ask for alternatives in the context of rethinking the role of companies in the cybersecurity world. Thank you.
Answer. We have 2 or 3 minutes left, so please. Yeah.
No, it's a tough question. So in the French context, they tried the Minitel, it didn't really work. In the Ethiopian context, they had the WaredaNet, didn't work. So again, that's the big question: is that if we can't fix the problem in Europe itself, how can you fix it somewhere else? Because it's a question of monopoly and kind of the finances there. So in terms of how is resistance, I'm not entirely convinced that you can resist within the platforms themselves, outside maybe some regulation, which tends to be a buzzword where not much happens anyways. But again, you can think about alternative forms and ways of communication that have always existed, but that would require kind of resisting the digital platform economy entirely and move beyond its constraints. But within that framework, I don't know, it's going to be very easy to provide ethical kind of platform communication. I'm increasingly skeptical of that. So.
Well, and then there is another question left. Just a final comment. I'm just talking about. You were several to talk about the free service, notion associated with these companies. But when you try to think about the war in Ukraine, although I get that the digital sovereignty of the country is not the main preoccupation for now, but when you think about the different degrees of involvement of these companies into into Kyiv's war efforts, you might think about to what degree Kyiv is actually dependent from these companies. So in terms of technological dependencies and sovereignty, that raised quite many questions. And also most of your presentations were also dealing with rhetoric, actually. So the way these companies try to shape their own responsibility, their own behavior through particular discourse. And here, what I think, there's potential avenue for research on the agenda setting and norm shaping, actually, policies of these companies. So there is some, pending research on these topics, but I think this is one key dimension of the involvement of these companies. So, this is a personal comment here, just trying to build on your respective talks. And there is just 30 seconds left to ask a question. But if there is no rising hand, I think we'll finish with these words. Fine. So let's.
Oh, okay, wonderful, thank you. So thank you so much, everyone. I promise I'll be taking really 2 minutes to conclude these two very intense, very dense, and I hope you agree with me, very interesting days of conference. So I think that we have started, or well, continued in some respects, but started in others a conversation in so many ways in these 2 days. I won't attempt to summarize the summaries that have been done throughout these 2 days, last but not least from Julien for this last panel a few minutes ago. But I just want to point out how I think that this work, among other important implications, really contributes to nuance some notions that are being heavily used both in public policy, in media treatment of these issues, and sometimes perhaps more often than it should in academic treatment of these notions. One of them is obviously big tech. So we think about a few companies when we first think about big tech. All of your presentations have shown that, well, there is a lot to this notion to complexify it further and to fully understand all that is behind it in terms of size of companies, of scale, of reach, of geopolitical strategies that are behind these actors. So that's something that we will surely keep on having conversations about. And other such notions are definitely digital sovereignty. So some of these last panel has shown the extent to which we really must address by categorizing, by typifying, by well, doing a number of things to try and systematize and make sense of all the ways in which this notion is being used currently. And I could go on, but just to give 2 examples of why we will definitely try to move this conversation, to keep on moving this conversation forward. And in this regard, we will definitely come back to all of you, including a few very excellent contributions that we were not able to include in this program for sheer lack of space, to think about a joint publication and possibly to future steps. So thanks so much to all of you. I would just want to reiterate the extent to which we are all very much in debt to Margaret and Gulnara on a CARISM side, because yeah. This is definitely like their core idea. Marguerite in particular, who's a PhD thesis closely connected to, very closely connected to some what has been said in these 2 days. To Xenia Machina, my partner in crime on Centre Internet et Société side, for this and many other projects for like a decade, I guess, to Florian and Jeanne, our interns on both CARISM and CIS side, that have helped us in innumerable ways in these 48 hours. And the scientific committee, who has like reviewed all of your contributions, it is made of like CARISM and CIS colleagues and by so many others in France, in Europe, and the world, and also the administrative teams on both sides, because well, there have been a number of missions organized and catering reserved and so on. So they are not here, but thanks to them very much. And most of all, thanks to all the presenters and chairs and keynote speakers who have made this conference so interesting and innovative. Thank you so much, and hope to see you guys very soon. Cross path in some place, including virtual. Thank you so much.
Thanks to Francesca.